Hello, welcome to Prairie Conservation Action Plan's webinar. My name is Caitlin Morose and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Check out other PCAP events. If you are in the Regina area, come see a burrowing owl on Sunday at 1:30 p.m. at Cabela's. This is part of our Native Prairie Speaker Series. Join Joe Smith from the University of Montana talk about sage grouse in a webinar presentation on Wednesday at noon. These events are free. Check out the PCAP website for more information. I would like to take a moment to note that in-kind support for this project has been given by Ranchers Stewardship Alliance, Inc. This project was undertaken with the financial support of the Government of Canada and the Federal Department of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Now, a bit about our presenter. Sue is a livestock producer and conservation practitioner who lives near Eastend, Saskatchewan. Sue's work experience centers on range management, conservation planning, agri-environmental policy, and the use of incentives and market-based instruments in grassland conservation. She is a co-founder and director of the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance, a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering ranchers with the ability to manage native grasslands in a sustainable and profitable manner that provides environmental benefits to all of society. Before we begin, I would like to mention that if you have any questions, please type it into the questions section on your webinar dashboard. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. And now I will turn it over to Sue.
Okay, what can you see?
We can see your screen perfectly. You are good to go.
Great. Okay, well, today I'll be discussing different ways of placing economic values on the ecosystem goods and services provided by Native Prairie. And if you've taken in some of the other presentations during the Prairie's Got the Goods week, you'll have heard a lot about the importance of those goods and services. But how do we make sure that they're accounted for in policy and development decisions? Other than lobbying, which is effective but only has a temporary result, the primary method is by giving them an economic value. So first, I'll tell you a tiny bit about the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance. We are working with our partners currently to evaluate market-based incentives from around the world for applicability to the Northern Great Plains. We're looking at research methods of placing economic values on ecological goods and services provided by natural grasslands grazed by livestock. We're working on building a new model of conservation programming that works for ranchers and species at risk, which is results-based and remuneration-based. And we also participate in a network of organizations across Canada who are working on ecosystem services programming. So this slide shows a graphic wheel depicting the ecosystem services provided for grasslands, and you've probably seen a number of graphics like this. It divides the ecosystem services into provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural ecosystem services. This one, however, is one of the few that I've seen that has been specifically developed for grasslands. And you'll see that there are a number of ecosystem services on here that can be applied to any ecosystem. So clean air, clean water, habitat, temperature regulation, water purification, photosynthesis, soil formation, and most of the cultural services are all fairly generic. There are a few on here that are specific to grasslands. You'll see under the provisioning section a forage service, which is specific to providing forage for animals. You'll see a food service or good on there that is on some lists but not on all. It's very relevant to the grasslands, which provide us with a significant amount of food. And you'll see on the left side a stewardship service, which this is actually the first time I've seen it on a listing of ecosystem services, and you'll see that they've kind of strategically placed it on the border between cultural and supporting, because stewardship supports a lot of the other ecosystem services, but it is a cultural service. So one of the things I would like to talk about today is the biodiversity ecosystem service, and you can see it listed on this particular graphic under supporting services. Biodiversity is not on all lists of ecosystem goods and services, and that's because at the turn of our last century there was an ecosystem assessment done called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and they looked at the provision of ecosystem services globally. And one of the things that they determined was that biodiversity was not actually an ecosystem good or service. They did, however, determine that things like genetic resources, biochemicals, medicines, pharmaceuticals, and food were ecosystem services, and those are all derived from biodiversity. So this graphic doesn't actually list any of those services that are provided by biodiversity except food. And I'm not sure whether one method or the other is better, but what seems to happen is that most people think of the main value of biodiversity in terms of the cultural services that it provides, so the recreational, aesthetic, and spiritual. And when biodiversity is viewed in those terms, it has a very low economic value. However, when it's viewed as providing medicine, pharmaceuticals, agrochemicals, and food, it may well be the greatest service of all the ecosystem services in terms of economic value. And we're going to come back to this a little bit later. So in 2013, the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance commissioned a study on the valuation of native prairie grasslands. And some of you may have seen Chris Nikolek, who was the primary author on that document, present the results of this project. She presented this report in several locations across Saskatchewan, I think in 2014. So you may have seen this. So I'm going to hit the highlights of that report by going through the different methods, the results of the different methods that we use to value ecosystem goods and services. So we looked at 5 different ways of valuing the ecosystem goods and services on native prairie. And the results of those methods vary quite widely. So this is method number 1 showing on the screen right now. What we looked at, we thought that the obvious thing to do first, right, is to look at the valuations that other people have developed for native grasslands. And so what that showed was that the average of the values that other people have put on native prairie is about $300 per acre per year. And the next 5 slides will all be, in case I forget to say this, in Canadian dollars in 2012 equivalent. So this particular method, just in case you're wondering and have some background in some of these studies, it does include the PFRA study that was completed on the Saskatchewan PFRA pastures in 2004. And it also includes the Costanza assessment that's very widely referenced in terms of economic values for ecosystem services. So Chris notes that this could be safely considered a gross underestimate due to the lack of adequate data for full calculation purposes. And if you think about that, it's fairly obvious. Data's fairly readily available to calculate values for things like recreation or carbon sequestration. but it's much more difficult to place economic values on services like clean air or temperature regulation. So this nearly $300 per acre per year could safely be considered a low-end value, and as such can still be considerable benefit to policymakers. So the second method we looked at is actually one of the most common methods for placing an economic value on an ecosystem service. This is looking at opportunity costs, and it's land trusts use a form of this method when they determine how much to pay for conservation easements. Alice uses a form of this method when they're determining the annual payment for land enrolled in their programs. And in this situation, opportunity cost is basically the income that the landowner forgoes by retaining native prairie rather than developing the land to its highest and best use. Now, highest and best use is not my term. That's a real estate term that looks at development value, and it doesn't incorporate any values at all for ecosystem goods and services. So with our evaluation, we took the perspective of an agricultural producer. So we looked at the conversion of native prairie to other agricultural crops. And that was for our purposes. If it was someone else doing this assessment, say if the provincial government wanted to do an assessment like this, they might look at other values such as petroleum or mineral development. So because we are agricultural producers, we looked at other agricultural crops as our opportunity cost. And what we did, it's difficult to find comparable statistics for the profit or income from a wide variety of crops across a wide variety of land productivity. And so what we used as a surrogate for that was crop insurance coverage, because that's exactly what they do. They use real market values by type of crop, and they have information for the varying productivity of the land. And so what we did, we took these are real parcels of land. One, and they're both within the mixed grass ecozone, and they're both still, or they were in 2012 or 2013, still in native prairie. And so we took the data that crop insurance had for those two parcels of land. So one is an extremely low productivity Class L land. The other is an extremely high productivity land, Class B. And we used the insurable data available for those two parcels. And so you can see at that time, the only form of crop insurance available for native prairie was rainfall forage insurance. And so in 2013, you could have insured the Class L land for $6 an acre if you had native grassland, the Class B land for $10 an acre, and if you had any other kind of crop, you could insure it for considerably more. And again, this is based on the profit that you could expect from the land if you were growing those different crops. So if you look at canola, the Class L land could have been insured for $198 an acre. The Class B land for $358 an acre, compared to $6 and $10 an acre. And even if you looked at the difference between native grassland and alfalfa, the Class L land could have been insured for $54.25 an acre. Oh, that's alfalfa grass, sorry, for $82.17 an acre if you had alfalfa. So that's more than 10 times what you could insure it for if you kept it in native grassland. So that's how we came up with our comparisons. And so the opportunity cost for native prairie then ranged between $21.58 for a conversion on a low productivity grassland to just a different forage crop to $1,836.80 if we converted our native grassland to potatoes. So the third method that we looked at, and again this is another common method, this is the type of method that the NRCS and the Sagegrass Initiative in the US use to pay for conservation programming on the lands they have enrolled. And so we just thought, let's find out how much it costs organizations to steward land, organizations that manage land but don't have any livestock, and so they don't have an economic interest in the land, they're strictly managing for stewardship. And these included government agencies and land trusts and other conservation organizations. So we looked at things like how much does it cost them to manage for things like invasive species and biodiversity, how much does it cost them to make management plans or to monitor their activities, how much does it cost them to administer the stewardship of those lands. And so these are all real costs, and we found that those costs ranged between $5.20 an acre and $13.88 per acre. And Chris notes in her summary that the amount and nature of management applied by partners varies greatly, and we called them partners because they wanted to remain anonymous and have their data remain anonymous. So it does vary greatly. Some partners had costs that included things like grassland restoration costs, and then you have the associated restoration equipment and maintenance of that equipment. And some other partners didn't need to do any restoration at all. And some organizations did very little management, although Chris notes that doing very little management should not necessarily be considered good management. And other partners did a lot of management. And some organizations, you can see actually from this table, some organizations were able to be more efficient with their dollars just because of the acreage margin. So the most efficient partner who came in at the low of $5.20 an acre was managing nearly 2.3 million acres. And the partner that came in at the high end of $13.88 was only managing 41,000 acres. So that's there's a large reflection of efficiency in those data. The fourth method, actually the next couple of methods that I'm going to discuss that we looked at are maybe a little bit less politically correct than most organizations would look at, but we thought it was important to evaluate ecosystem goods and services in terms of the policy risks to the retention of native prairie. And so this particular method looks at subsidy support to competing land uses. And again, we chose only to look at other crops. You might consider looking at this using this particular method to look at petroleum and mineral subsidies to petroleum and mineral development. And it may look similar, it may look very different. I have no idea. So we chose to look at the subsidies to crop production. And I'll just read Chris's little summary paragraph here. So taxpayers have paid significant amounts of money to support the grains and oilseed export industry, often at the expense of other forms of agriculture such as beef production using native prairie grasslands. The total amount of direct payments made to producers in the prairies between, that's a 30-year period, between 81 and 2011 was $42 billion. And the bulk of this amount was paid to farmers with cultivated crops, not beef producers. And so we were unable to come up with a value per acre for using this method, but $42 billion over 30 years averages 1.4 billion a year, which is very significant. And that just includes the subsidies to the alternative uses of native prairie, not the profit from the crops. And so this was the last method that we looked at. Again, we're looking at the result of a policy. So we looked at the cost of restoring native prairie once it's been lost. So what Chris did was she looked at the programs, the cropland conversion programs for the prairies, and found that the government expenditures to reseed cropland back to a very basic native species mix have cost taxpayers up to $109 per acre. Now the average of what she looked at, and we weren't able to separate out tame species reseeding from native species reseeding. So the average was 71.82, and the range was between 12.70 and 109.16 per acre. And because it costs more to reseed native species than tame, you can assume that the 109 was probably native and the 12.70 was probably tame. And so then you have a range in between that. And so it's also important to realize that that's just the reseeding costs. So there are additional forage establishment costs beyond this payout, likely in the order of $57 per acre in 2012 dollars. So one of the things that I learned last week when we were preparing this was that sod cap is paying in the order of $250 an acre for the restoration of native prairie. And if you add the $109 per acre and the $57 per acre here and convert from 2012 dollars into 2017 dollars, you'd probably come pretty close to $250 an acre. So so that's what we're paying to restore. And I think from the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance perspective, it seems counterproductive to pay subsidies to break up native prairie and then to pay subsidies to restore it again. So, and keeping in mind that you can't fully restore native prairie, you can only restore a few components of it. So unfortunately, there are many conservation programs that are still focused on restoration and consume considerable funds in the process. So our conclusion from this was, if it's worth this much to restore, surely it's worth this much to conserve. So I said we were going to come back to the discussion of biodiversity as an ecosystem service. And again, the reason I'm coming back to it is because the value of biodiversity on grasslands for pharmaceuticals and agrochemicals has been largely ignored. And people may know that the bulk of our pharmaceuticals and agrochemicals originally come from a plant or animal or microorganism, and that researchers often learn to synthesize or cultivate that product. And this has been happening for a very long time. One of the earliest antibiotics, for example, tetracycline, was discovered when researchers wondered why mosquitoes could carry malaria and not be affected by it. And most people probably know that aspirin came from the bark of willows, and there's still a huge amount of research going into finding, particularly medicines from biodiversity. So I wanted to see if there'd been any evaluation studies done on the economic value of biodiversity as a source of pharmaceuticals and agrochemicals. So I did a little Google search, and it turns out there is a lot of information out there, most of it in relation to forests, but there is still significant information on how to put an economic value on biodiversity as a source of pharmaceuticals. And so there's two methods that I'm going to show you that put value on a particular vascular plant species, and they're very different methods and they have very different results. So I wanted to show you both of them just to show you the range. So this example, so Farnsworth and Soyarto were trying to answer the question, what is the dollar value that can be placed on a single plant species growing in the U.S. should that plant species become extinct? And so they based this, their economic data here, on the average prescription price and the percentage of prescriptions that contain one or more active ingredients from vascular plants. So the total value of prescriptions containing ingredients for plants, and this is from the U.S., is 23.3 billion. The number of plant species that are used in those prescriptions are 40, so they're 40 species. And then they've simply done a multiplier there to come up with the value per successful plant species of 583 million. And so of all the, of all the plants that they've investigated for a medicinal value, only about 1 in 125 shows any medicinal value. And so the value, so that's how they determine the value per successful plant species. And so if you want to come up with a value per plant species before it's been investigated, then each single plant species is worth $4.66 million. And I took the liberty of multiplying that by approximately 400 native prairie vascular plant species, which is what you could expect on a relatively large parcel of native prairie. And that would come out to $1.864 billion. And so those are fairly significant values. However, if you calculate the value a different way, it will look even better. So this valuation method from Principe is based on the annual mortality rate, human mortality rate due to cancer, and the percentage of deaths that are prevented by anti-cancer drugs derived from plants. Now the percent of anti-cancer drugs derived from plants is 40%. So 40% of our anti-cancer drugs come from vascular plants. The number of annual lives saved by the plant anti-cancer drugs is about 69,000 a year. And a life saved, the definition of that is that a person lives at least 5 years post-diagnosis. So then they use the value of a life saved, which is based on a statistical study of willingness to pay. And that is, so the value of a life saved is $18 million. And so the annual value of plant-derived drugs per successful species, calculated in a similar way to the last one, so it's the last example, so it's based on the average prescription price, $86 billion. And in this situation, the probability of success is 1 in 2,000 plant species. So for every 2,000 plant species they investigate, only one has anti-cancer components in it. And so the last one was any medicinal value. This one is specific to cancer, so that's why it's so much lower probability of success. So in this example, the value per plant species comes out to $43.2 million. In the last example, it was $4.66 million, so 10 times more value on a plant species from a cancer perspective than for the full range of medical values. And so again, I multiplied this by about 400 native prairie vascular plant species to come up with a total value of $17.3 billion. So you can see there's an amazing amount of value in biodiversity for pharmaceuticals or agrochemicals. And you know, perhaps it's in the best interests of some of these companies to invest in biodiversity conservation. So despite the significant economic values of ecosystem services, native prairie is still declining. So this is a graphic from a study that was done in the US looking at land converted to crop production between 2008 and 2012. And fully 77% of that new cropland came out of grassland. You can see forest was only 3% of forests were converted to cropland and only 2% of wetlands, but 77% of it came from grassland. And here's another graphic. This is the World Wildlife Fund's plow print report that some of you may be familiar with. And so they looked at areas of grassland, rate of grassland conversion across the Great Plains. And this particular graphic shows the conversion rate between 2014 and 2015. So this is only one year of conversion. And you can see the counties in red have experienced the highest rates of conversion, while the counties in green the lowest rates. And so look at us go in Saskatchewan. We've lost more grassland than any other jurisdiction in the northern Great Plains in just that 1 year. So there's still a significant amount of risk to native prairie, and too many risks that favor the loss of native prairie and erode the provisioning of ecosystem services. And so I have just made a short list of some policies that might look very different if they took into account the economic value of ecosystem goods and services. And again, this is just kind of a shotgun smattering of policies based on the projects and initiatives that the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance is involved in. So it's by no means comprehensive, and I'm not trying to point out any particular bad guys. It's just examples. So internationally, there are carbon standards that recommend sequestration payments for native prairie that's at high risk of being plowed, but no payments for native prairie that's considered at low risk. Even though the sequestration of carbon on those two different native prairies are probably similar. So nationally, we have species at risk legislation that may include the restriction of activities on native prairie that's considered critical habitat, while lands that are no longer native prairie or are native prairie but not critical habitat are free to implement any activities. We're developing beef sustainability standards that will restrict the plowing of native prairie and will increase costs to livestock producers but provide no premium for the beef that's sold under those standards. We have federal funding programs that support $250 an acre grass reestablishment costs, with few participants lining up to uptake that program. While on the other hand, there's a waiting list of native prairie land managers waiting to participate in conservation programs that cost as little as $1.50 an acre, and we've talked about that previously. And provincially, we are about to enter into a year where the municipal tax on native prairie, which is included in this category of non-arable land or pasture land. So we're increasing taxes, municipal taxes on native prairie, while cultivated land taxes will remain unchanged. And there was a day in the past when this might have been an issue that PCAP took on. Couple of other situations in the province that are providing risk to native prairie. The conservation offset programs that really result in a net loss of native prairie, even though they might be billed as no net loss. And then continuing to provide large subsidies to land uses that drive destruction of native prairie while resisting incentives for land uses that support the retention of native prairie and the species it supports. So again, we had quite a large discussion of the subsidy issue in our, I think it was the 4th method of evaluation that we reviewed. So are there any solutions to our issues? So this is a summary of a conservation framework for the North American Grasslands Alliance, which is a large group of different conservation organizations, different government agencies, and different land use user organizations. And many people work for or belong to organizations that were part of this, were or are part of this initiative. So this group got together and came up with a framework for conserving the North American grasslands. Basically, the vision, which you can see in the very center of the framework there, says North American grasslands are environmentally healthy and productive ecosystems that sustain working landscapes, conserve biodiversity, and support vibrant rural communities. And so there's a whole suite of principles, objectives, and not included in the summary, but in the actual framework are another whole suite of activities that support the objectives and the principles in order to meet the vision. So we spent a lot of time over a couple of years coming up with this framework. However, we also came up with a list of enabling conditions that needed to be in place in order for us to be successful in meeting our vision, I guess you could say. And there are 6 of those enabling conditions, and they float around the outside edges of that wheel there. And I'm going to just read them to you and comment on whether or not they are in place, because they must be in place in order for us to be successful at grassland conservation. So I'm going to start at the top right-hand side there at 1 o'clock. So public support for grassland conservation. I would say that's probably fairly high right now. So I guess we can say that is in place. The second one, grassland conservation is a foundation of the ranching culture. That one is fairly high, but probably tentative. So I would say partially in place. Then the next one says sustainable natural grassland uses are economically viable land use alternatives. That is not in place. Incentives to implement conservation programs are equal to or better than incentives for alternative land uses. Again, definitely not in place. 5th one, continuity of policy for grassland conservation bridges economic and political cycles, and what's intended there is that grassland policy doesn't change every time a government changes and doesn't change every time we enter a new phase of the economic cycle. And I would say that's definitely not in place. And the last one, North American grassland conservation networks facilitate collaboration and information exchange. And I would say that's partially in place. So of the 6, we've got 1 that's probably in place, 2 that are partially in place, and 3 that are definitely not in place. So there's some big hurdles to overcome before we can hope to conserve the ecosystem goods and services coming from grasslands. And those 3 that are not in place at all are mainly economic conditions, and those could be enabled if we were to consider economic services using their economic value and consider them in relation to the traditional market economy. So lastly here, I would just like to talk about a couple of actual program-related solutions. So the last slide was more big scale, and so bring it down a little bit to things that we might be able to influence more regionally or locally. So financial incentives need to be provided to owners, managers of native prairie that are at least equal to incentives provided to owners and managers of other land uses, or other lands with uses that provide lower quality ecosystem services. And again, you'll see the similarity between the wording here and one of those enabling conditions that circled around the outside of that last wheel. So those incentives should ideally be results-based, so society knows that there's an actual benefit provided in exchange for the incentive provided. And so I want to talk just briefly about two examples, one close to home and one a little bit further afield, that are examples of what I'm talking about here. So in Florida, ranchers and land trusts are being paid to hold back water during rain events. And then that water is released into the Everglades slowly during the dry season to prevent the Everglades from drying out. And this is, you know, the big issue with the Everglades is that they're drying out. And that's because development has reduced the number of wetlands and the amount of natural land cover so that the regulating service of flood control no longer exists. So we're having to replace that naturally provided regulating service with an artificially provided service. And so so the people who are people or organizations who are doing that are giving up land and the potential income off of that land to store and then release water. So that's one example, and the reason I use that one is because it illustrates a regulating service that we have issues with in Saskatchewan, but we haven't come up with any good solutions for a surrogate for the natural regulating service. The other example that I wanted to talk a little bit about is one that probably everyone has already heard about. So Miles Anderson is a rancher who is managing land for certain habitat attributes for greater sage-grouse down by Grasslands National Park, and he's received a number of awards recently because of his success in doing that. And in fact, it's looking like he is actually increasing the sage-grouse population locally there. So that's a very successful project that we certainly would like to see some more of, not necessarily applied strictly to sage-grouse, but certainly could be used to benefit other species at risk. So if we can move some funds from the programs that disincent native prairie conservation to programs that provide incentives to support some of the ecosystem services from native prairie, then we'll have a chance of reversing the trend towards loss of those ecosystem services. So that's the end of the presentation. If people have questions, I am happy to entertain them.
Thank you very much, Sue. That was very interesting. For any of our listeners out there, if you have any questions, please feel free to type it into the questions section of your webinar dashboard. Sue, with the recent budget announcement about the provincial pastures, what are your thoughts about that?
Oh, yes. It's a very good question. And I guess I'm going to have to answer this mostly from a personal perspective. I think that particular policy solution may have looked different if they had incorporated the economic value of the ecological goods and services from those pastures. And again, I suspect I know where this question is coming from, but a similar situation to what happened or is happening with the PFRA pastures. It is possible that the ecological services from those pastures may be at risk. I'm not 100% sure that getting rid of the pastures program is definitely a risk. I think there are many things that can still be done to make sure that the ecological services from those pastures are retained in whatever direction the government decides to go with the actual land. And so again, it comes down to, will there be an incentive for people to retain native prairie and to retain those ecological services, or will the financial incentive be in the opportunity cost, and so people will push to convert them to other land uses? That's really the crux of that entire both the PFRA and the provincial pastures issue.
Good, thank you. Our next question, at the end of your presentation, you were talking about transferring funds to provide more incentives for landowners keeping their land in a native prairie state. How would that happen? What would have to go about to make that happen?
So in that situation, what we're talking about is just simply a shift in policy direction, right? We don't have to change any legislation. We don't have to make any big changes. It's just a matter of shifting money out of the programming that provides disincentives and putting it into programming that provides incentives. And so that can be, for example, maybe take some money out of the grassland restoration budgets and put it into results-based programming, or any programming that provides an incentive to retain native prairie. Or it could be, which would be maybe a little more controversial, taking money out of providing subsidies to crop production and putting it into providing incentives to retain ecological goods and services. So some of these are simply budgeting, of course, government budgeting issue, and some of them are a little more shifting policies from one perspective to another.
Great. Thank you very much, Sue. For any of our listeners out there, if you have any questions for Sue, please feel free to type into the question section now. I would just like to remind everyone that this webinar has been recorded and it will be uploaded to the PCAP YouTube channel later today. And that's youtube.com/user/skpcap. And you'll be able to share that link with anyone who's not able to make it. There is a question here from a listener named Oren. Can you describe results-based programming, please?
I certainly can. I even have a definition if you can still see my screen. So the definition of results-based programming is basically defining realistic expected results, monitoring progress towards the achievement of those results, and integrating lessons learned into management decisions and reporting on performance. So it's so a realistic expected result is something that's defined, right? So you might be looking at increasing the number of sage grouse by 1%. You might be looking at something like habitat attributes, like Miles Anderson is doing. So that might include a certain percentage of forbs in a plant community, or it might be a certain targeted height of vegetation. But a specifically defined result that can be measured and can be targeted, and then a payment or an incentive is contingent on meeting that result.
Thank you, Sue. What are some organizations that are doing that now?
That's a very good question. So certainly the South of the Divide Conservation Action Program is the primary organization that is implementing results-based programming in Saskatchewan. The Ranchers Stewardship Alliance was instrumental in developing the protocols for results-based programming that SODCAP uses, and SODCAP, to my knowledge, is implementing results-based for sage grouse and Sprague's pipit and swift fox. The Ranchers Stewardship Alliance is working on developing protocols now for, in partnership with PCAP actually, for burrowing owl and piping plover. So it's been here. It's been focused on species at risk, but it doesn't have to be. You know, the program that I talked about in the Everglades is focused on is also a results-based program, and it is focused on keeping a certain level of water in the Everglades, and so that's perfectly measurable, and it's in relation to different times of the year, and so that those are examples of results-based provision of results-based programs that can be monitored, and you can say for sure that a result is being achieved.
Great, thank you very much, Sue. And I was also wondering if you could tell our listeners about just a little bit more about Ranchers Stewardship Alliance, how you kind of got the organization going and why.
Oh, that is a good question. So I guess the catalyst for the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance was in the very early days of the South of the Divide initiative. Back when we were starting out with the Species at Risk Act in Canada, and there was a provincial federal agreement between Saskatchewan and the federal government to co-manage an area in Saskatchewan for the benefit of species at risk. And so the agreement was in place, and a lot of information was being gathered by the various government organizations, but there wasn't much information coming out about how producers were going to be, or landowners for that matter, were going to be impacted by the initiative. And so traditionally, I guess, livestock producers had either participated in consultation sessions as individuals or as part of a producer organization, which meant that you were a little bit fragmented on your input, right? And so we thought we needed to organize ourselves so that we could speak with one voice and have a little more impact on what might happen. And so, not that I'm saying producer groups are not effective, but they have a whole lot of other things to look at besides conservation. And so that was really the catalyst. We sat down together and tried to figure out what we wanted to do, and decided we would organize the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance, and that was in 2010. So here we are in 2017.
That's great. Thank you very much for sharing that story. It looks like we don't have any more questions coming in. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much, Sue, for the great presentation. I would also like to thank all of our listeners today for tuning in to this broadcast. As you leave the presentation, feedback survey will pop up. If you don't mind taking a minute to answer a couple of questions there, we would really appreciate it. So with that, I'd like to wish everyone a great day and a great weekend. Enjoy this beautiful weather. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Bye.